understand how plants function and survive, we have to keep in mind what happens inside cells, particularly during photosynthesis. If you've never been taught cell biology or the intricacies of photosynthesis, don't worry. Essentially, we have to understand just one simple fact. Cells are made of molecules that must have particular shapes and arrangements in order to work effectively. Alternatively, a condition of stress is simply when the various structures and components and processes occurring within cells don't work as effectively as they could. This is either because the plants don't have enough resources in order to make these components, or because other factors, non-resource factors, disrupt the structures and processes. So effectively there are two main causes of stress: a lack of resources to produce molecules, or disruption of existing molecules. But stress is a condition that has a single simple definition: the suboptimal functioning of cells. Within plant cells, photosynthesis is particularly delicate because it's essentially about managing the energy levels of electrons and atoms in such a way that biological molecules can be produced. Understanding that photosynthesis is affected not just by resources but by non-resource factors is something that's crucial to understanding plant function and plant ecology, particularly when it comes to light. In ecology, light is often seen simply as a resource. Plants photosynthesize and need light. Getting light is crucial to survival. Plants compete with each other for light because it's a limiting resource. It sounds reasonable, but this is only half the picture, and actually not a very realistic one. Light, of course, is a form of energy that interacts with matter, with atoms and molecules, such as molecules of chlorophyll, essentially by donating its energy to the electrons that make up the bonds between atoms, exciting them. This excitation energy can be passed between molecules to energize electrons and eventually to make chemical bonds that link biological molecules together. That's an extremely simplified but fundamentally correct description of photosynthesis. The point is that when electrons absorb energy, it can be too much. And when electrons have too much energy, they don't occupy the space between atoms in a way that binds the atoms together. They're not strongly or appropriately associated with the atomic nuclei, resulting in the molecules falling apart. Even chlorophyll, when it absorbs energy from too many photons, can degrade. In fact, photosynthetic cells must constantly protect, repair, or replace chlorophyll. And if you've ever extracted chlorophyll in a school lab experiment, you'll have been told to keep it out of the light because it breaks down very quickly. Outside of the cell, it doesn't have the usual supporting structures and repair mechanisms that keep it working. And that light can be excessive and dangerous to photosynthesis is an extremely well understood phenomenon known as photoinhibition, or photodamage when it's extreme. It's easy to fall into the trap of assuming that more light equals more photosynthesis, equals more biomass and more productivity. But imagine thinking that more gas or petrol means that your automobile or car can simply do more, go further, and is better. So you just keep filling the gas tank, keep filling, and anyone that gets in your way must be fought off. In reality, you wouldn't keep pumping gas into your gas tank until it overflows, because there's a point at which it's no longer needed, and an excess actually becomes dangerous, certainly not worth fighting for. For plants on a sunny day, this point is typically around midday. They've been photosynthesizing all morning, the sugars have built up in the entire plant, and the photosynthetic cells eventually fill up with crystals of what we call primary starch. The gas tank is full. Any more light energy can't be used, but the chlorophyll keeps absorbing it, and it starts to become a dangerous problem, breaking down the chlorophyll. The energy must be shunted away from the chlorophyll, and plants have a few tricks to do this. Additional pigment molecules, such as red anthocyanins or yellow carotenoids, are used to either block light or to accept the energy and to help with eventually dissipating it into heat. But there's one basic physical phenomenon that chlorophyll uses to protect itself. It's a trick that all plants do, and it's something that demonstrates that for all plants, light can be a problem that must be managed, and that they're adapted to deal with light not just as a resource, but as a potentially damaging environmental factor. When chlorophyll accepts photons of light, it becomes excited, which in practice means that the electrons that form part of its structure change position. But if this excitation energy is not used, the electrons tend to fall back into their lower energy state, so they change position back to how they were. And the energy has to leave the system. In fact, it leaves as photons of light, a phenomenon that we know as fluorescence. In other words, when sunlight is excessive, particularly when plants are in a condition of stress and they really can't deal with that extra energy, plants will actually emit a subtle background glow as they fluoresce light back into the environment. This chlorophyll fluorescence, which we usually don't see because the sunlight is so much stronger, is lower energy light, and in practice this means that it's a red glow emitted from the leaves. Chlorophyll fluorescence demonstrates the universal ability of plants to deal with light as a damaging stress factor, rather than simply as a resource. As the fluorescence is a gentle background glow, I have to cut out the sunlight and induce the fluorescence with a less visible but nonetheless strong light source. I'm simply showing that the plants can do this, and I'm not worried about putting a number on how much fluorescence there is and how stressed precisely these plants are, but machines do exist that can quantify this. Okay, so this is a real capability of all plants that they use to manage a potential stress factor, too much light. So coming back to ecology, sometimes you may hear that species are present in their habitats because they are, and I quote, the superior competitor in that habitat. This assumes that the environment is simply a provider of resources and that plants interact with the environment and with each other by obtaining and modifying resources. And this is one of the basic premises of what we call competition theory in ecology. Competition for resources can be important, but plants don't grow where they do because they are the superior competitors, but because they're the most appropriately adapted. They are the fittest and they survive. And that doesn't always involve competition. The appropriate language to use in ecology is survival of the fittest, just as it is in the rest of biology. In fact, in the words of Darwin, two canine animals in a time of dearth may be truly said to struggle with each other, for which shall get food and live. But a plant on the edge of a desert is said to struggle for life against the drought. In other words, it's the individual that survives or not, and often other plants or other organisms are not involved in these life or death events. As another way of illustrating this, I'd just like to show you a few examples that I've seen in different environments around the world that can be interpreted in terms of individual plants surviving because they are adapted to tolerate harsh environmental conditions, but other plants are evidently not involved. Alternatively, it's really difficult to interpret the presence of these species in their habitats as being due to, in a sense, having won some kind of battle with another species. So coming back to the main point, if you see the environment only in terms of resources for growth and think that plants are mainly adapted to the availability of resources, which is the main premise of competition theory in ecology, then I'm sure that's fine for maybe interpreting hypothetical models of how plant communities should logically be. I'm not sure how you can use these ideas to understand how 64 species coexist together in a real grassland. Just to keep it real, let's consider the identities and adaptations of real species. Does the early spider orchid, Ophrys sphegodes, live here because it is the superior competitor? For what? For light or for nutrients? Is an epiphytic bromeliad growing on a tree in Panama a superior competitor? And is it competing against the tree? Or should we restrict what we consider to be the plant community to just the bromeliads or just the orchids, so that we can make that competition theory work for us and really understand that model? If, on the other hand, the thing that you want to understand is the natural world or plant communities, a different approach is probably of more actual use, centered on concepts more like plant biology natural selection, physics, and things like that, which have more of a scientific basis and are supported by a vast amount of empirical evidence, which really, seriously, should not be overlooked in ecology.